thank you for coming this evening and for the opportunity to talk to you and to try and address the question which I think we're all wrestling with and which I've been thinking about particularly a lot recently. It is a question of ethics, but it's something even more fundamental. In what way are journalists who consider themselves professionals still relevant? In an age when anyone can produce news, what is the role of the trained professional journalist, of the organized newsroom? For that matter, those who work in strategic communications or public relations, or in teaching any of those fields. Why study this if anybody can just do it? In an age when anyone can publish, there's an argument to be made that fact gathering will take care of itself. It will simply emerge from all the things that people are surfacing on their own. So, for that matter, might a sophisticated contextualization of what it all means. I mean, there's a zillion opinions every day about all the things that are being surfaced. And some very thoughtful people have argued what I think you might call the displacement theory about journalists and journalism. This is the idea that we really no longer need professional journalists to be engaged in fact-gathering and reporting. To the extent that we need journalists at all, maybe they can just focus a little bit on synthesis and interpretation. Here's a quote from Jonathan Stray, who works for the AP, that was in Harvard's Nieman Lab blog. No one needs a news organization to know what the White House is saying when all the press briefings are posted on YouTube. What we do need is someone to tell us what it means. C.W. Anderson, Emily Bell, and Clay Shirky, in their now famous manifesto, The Post-Industrial Journalism, argue, quote, the journalist has not been replaced, but displaced, moved higher up the editorial chain from the production of initial observations to a role that emphasizes interpretation and verification, bringing a sense to the streams of text, audio, photos, video produced by the public. So why study journalism? Why teach it? And if it exists at all, what ethics are there for it? Well, on the other side of this argument are those who seem hostile in some ways to change of any kind. Here's a quote from Bill Keller, who was at the time executive editor of the New York Times. The civic labor performed by journalists on the ground cannot be replicated by legions of bloggers sitting hunched over their computer screens. He said in a lecture, at a public lecture in London in 2007, he could have added in their pajamas in the middle of the night, perhaps. Well, I think that this argument, this polarization, this doubt that we need journalists at all misses the point and potentially creates a kind of argument in which much of what we know about journalism, what was built, gets denigrated, and journalists become hostile to the potential of the network and the new technology. This argument that we need journalists or we don't need journalists misses the point. It's a false dichotomy. And what I want to suggest is to think about journalism in a different way. Clive Thompson, in his new book, Smarter Than You Think, opens the book with this story. In 1997, Garry Kasparov, the Russian chess champion, was defeated by IBM's Deep Blue supercomputer in 6 consecutive games. In the last game, in 5 moves, Kasparov essentially just gave up. Many predicted that this was the final triumph of artificial intelligence over human intelligence. And, by the way, the end of chess, too, if anybody cared about that. Kasparov, after recovering from his being vanquished, had an idea. What if computing, human and computer chess intelligence collaborated? The machine's way of thinking, Kasparov thought, was fundamentally unhuman. Machines can hold vast amounts of data and can calculate at lightning speed, if uncreatively. Humans, however, can calculate a few moves ahead, but they have intuition, insight, they have psychology. He called this new thing where they would collaborate the centaur, or advanced chess. Freed from the need to rely largely on memory of past champions, Kasparov was able to focus more on what he could do and the machines could not. What he called the creative texture of his play. Playing this way in a series of matches, Kasparov discovered he could always beat the software. Always. And in collaboration with the software, Kasparov and the machine together could also beat any human. It was actually better than one alone. This notion of collaboration, of advanced chess, if you will, I think is how we need to think about the future of journalism. Rather than be hostile to the strengths of what the new technology has brought, or consider them a threat, we need to understand the strengths of what has been created by the network, by the digital revolution, and figure out how it fits in to make a better journalism. What do I mean by that? Every new technology has its unique strengths, its unique advantages. The printed books amplified memory. Actually, when the printed language, the written word, was developed, Sophocles worried because he thought it would create mental laziness if people could write things down and not have to remember them all. So the printed book amplified memory. The telegraph made simultaneous knowledge across long distances possible, but with limited words. The dropping of the cost of paper, which in the late 19th century was cut in half every 10 years, made the penny press possible and made journalism suddenly more available to far more people, which, by the way, led to the popular press and the pulling of journalism away from partisan control. Radio allowed us to hear the news for the first time, often live. Television, the ability to see events and to provide a kind of emotionalism to the news that we hadn't seen before. Cable made the news continuous. Okay, so every technology has its strengths. So what are the strengths brought by today's disruption? Well, as we learned from Big Deep Blue, the machines of the network can count. They bring us more data. They make the potential for the news to become more empirical. But the databases need translation. They need someone to make sense of the raw numbers and to present them in a way that are understandable. The network makes everyone potentially a publisher. We are all suddenly writers, editors. What does that give us? It makes a community of publishers, gives us more sentinels, more perspectives, more places to observe the news. It also gives us more experience and more intelligence in our understanding of the news. A snowstorm photographed by 1,000 people posting on Instagram will offer us a far richer pool of pictures of that storm than the staff of any newspaper in any town. The tweets of 1,000 eyewitnesses to a breaking news event will give us much more information than could be funneled through a police spokesperson. The knowledge of 1,000 heart specialists or climate scientists responding to the inquiry of a news organization that is trying to respond to something is far richer than the Rolodex of any one reporter. So what do journalists bring to this? What are the special strengths that could create this advanced chess? I'll list 4 here, and you may think of many others. I hope you do. That would mean you were actually thinking about this lecture after it was over. Journalists have, first, the access to interrogate those in power, to ask them questions, to get to the White House, or to the Speaker of the House or the Leader of the Senate, or perhaps the Mayor of Toronto. Journalists have the skills, the storytelling skills, to make the intelligence of these networks more understandable and to gather it into a public square where many people can see it and we're not just in our silos. The New York Times or National Public Radio curating raw tweets from Egypt or Syria, putting them in an order where what you're reading are the tweets, but organized in a way where they suddenly make more sense than if you were on Twitter alone. The skills to triangulate, to gather up the information from these distant places, and to use a network of reporters to do so, to organize the intelligence of both the machines and the community. And then a fourth quality, one that I think is often underestimated or misunderstood, that I would call the discipline and the humility of open-minded inquiry and a discipline of verification of evidence. This idea that journalists come to information with an open mind in a different way than the activist or the political propagandist or the political actor is often denigrated. It's the view from nowhere, as my friend Jay Rosen likes to say. It's this delusion of objectivity that journalists are somehow ciphers and have no preconceptions. What I think of as the journalistic approach to inquiry is very different than that. It's not the notion that journalists don't have a point of view, but it's the humility they bring to this, that they should not arrive at judgments, should not arrive at a point of view until they have explored all the other points of view. That they give all sides the chance to make their best argument, to try and understand them. The idea that in a community of people, we need someone to be a committed observer, someone who observes on behalf of the rest of us, not as an activist, not as a participant, in the same way that we ask police to do a particular job, or lawyers. In our legal system, a lawyer, everyone has the right to fair representation, even the worst person in society. And lawyers understand that professional discipline and that way of thinking. In this notion of journalism as a way of approaching evidence, it's also more than craft. Journalism is a way of looking at the world that is an intellectual discipline, in the same way that science is, in the same way that lawyers learn to think a certain way about evidence. I'm not sure that this intellectual discipline has always been thought of this way because it's so been fused to craft in the way it's been taught and the way it's been practiced. But as you move away from I am a TV journalist or I am a this kind of platform journalist, and you begin to think about what are the values that I bring to this, it elevates or should elevate the way we think about it to this higher level. So working in concert, these different parts of the network can create a new kind of journalism, one that might be best understood as a kind of organized collaborative intelligence, in which the journalist is a key organizer. When you think about journalism being disrupted, we go back to other industries that have been disrupted. The railroad industry at the beginning of the 20th century, it failed to understand, we've always heard, that they weren't in the railroad business, they were in the transportation business. Steam ships failed to understand they were in the transportation business as airlines began. This is the existential question. What is the function that journalists and other strategic communicators play in our society? It's not to write stories and put them on newscasts or in the newspaper and to sell advertising against them. That's the practice that we committed. But it's not the function that we play in people's lives. So what would the existential question and answer be for what does journalism do for us as citizens? I believe it's found in this idea of organizing the intelligence of the community and translating it for people and empowering people with it. Fundamentally, journalism has always taken the intelligence of many and made it more transparent. Taken the intelligence of the few, monitored the powerful, and made it more transparent. In that sense, journalism always plays this one fundamental role in our lives. It is democratizing because it gives information to more people. It's interesting when you look back at history. When the printing press was developed in about 1450, it took a monk a year to transcribe one copy of one Bible. There were 110 books in the Oxford University Library. 50 years later, there were 30,000 books in the Oxford Library and 300 million books circulating somewhere around Europe. It took 150 years after the creation of the printing press, the word fact first appears in the English language. We're at that kind of moment now, a moment of a new kind of enlightenment, if journalists can rise to understanding that their basic function of making information more plentiful to more people in a way that's fundamentally democratizing is exactly what's happening here. They are empowered by this technology, not threatened by it. So we need journalists in the future, which is to say, the future journalists in this room, to embrace the potential of the network, to vet and organize its input, while also providing the skilled elements that journalists at any given moment are uniquely disposed to offer. This is a way to a deeper and wider foundation of facts and community understanding. I said in one of the classes earlier today that in the research that I've done over and over, we've asked a question about why do you use the news? How do you use the news? And the number one reason in every time we've done this survey, the number one factor, not to save money, to help me with my job, to make me a better citizen, to be entertaining because it's fun, the number one reason people have told us over the years that they use the news is to talk to their friends and family and peers. News has always been social flow. It's the way we connect, the way we create community. I suspect that most of the students in this room gravitated to being in this program because at one point they started to tell stories and saw the connection that they made with other people when they did that. It's a kind of common ground that I think you'll find that crosses many generations of people who've engaged in communication. The first newspapers were founded in the early 17th century, starting around 1604, in coffee houses in Europe and public houses in the colonies here. We're in the colonies here. So what were coffee houses? They were places in port cities where people would come off ships and eat something and drink something. I think more than coffee, actually. And people would sit in these coffee houses and say, I just got off the boat from Genoa, and here's what's happening there. The first newspapers were literally the conversation in these coffee houses and public houses, written down, along with the ship manifest of what had arrived from another land, simply disseminated to other parts of the town. In the colonies here, the people who ran these public houses were called publicans, which was where the word publisher also is derived from. And they would keep a log on the end of the bar. And if you were a traveler, you could write down what you had seen in other places, stories, for other people to share. That might have been the first blog. So journalists in this vision that I have do much more now than produce narrative stories or graphics that illustrate them. Instead, they help gather and organize and structure the community's intelligence and combine the technology of the machinery of the network, the knowledge and the broader input of citizens and other sources, and add their repertorial, evidentiary, and vetting skills. This view sees journalism not as a static product, not as a product at all, but as a kind of service, a kind of organized community intelligence. Now, okay, so great. I've got this little construction here, this theoretical view that we identify the things that journalists do that are unique. We add them to the power that has been given to us by the new tools of the network. Sounds great. Very easy, right? Go off and do it. It's challenging. Lee Bollinger, who spent some time in Michigan as the dean of law school at the university, at a school that shall not be named, and as the president there, has said that the Supreme Court, in all of its First Amendment decisions, has essentially upheld one concept over and over, which is that out of a greater diversity of views and information, we are more likely to know the truth. This is what the First Amendment is all about. Vartan Gregorian, who runs the Carnegie Foundation, has said, however, also insightfully, I think, that when information is in greater supply, knowledge is actually harder to create. When information is in greater supply, knowledge is harder to create. Why is this? Because we have to sift through more conflicting evidence, more dissonance. So this is the paradox that we're in right now at the early stages of the digital disruption. We have the ingredients of a greater diversity of information that brings us closer to the truth. But sifting through it is more difficult. The tools of the network give us the capability to do the sifting, but we don't really know yet how to use these tools, let alone how they'll be subsidized. So this is the challenge. It also presents an ethical challenge. What guidelines do we have ethically as we're trying to figure out how to subsidize this new journalism? Where are the lines? Can we blur opinion and editorial? Can we blur advertising and news content in what we now call native advertising or sponsored content? We can talk about this more in question and answer, but I would say that what citizens need from their news, what they need from information about civic life and to navigate their way about the community, has not changed. We still need the news to be true. We still need it to be accurate. We still need the map that journalism gives us to draw the roads accurately so that we can navigate them. But how we achieve this in practice varies a great deal when the news that we get may come from many, many sources. One of those elements is that the qualities of what made something reliable in the old era could be embedded in the brand. It came from the Associated Press, I trust it. It's in the New York Times, I trust it. CBS News has learned, good enough for me. Today, any piece of news content that you may get could easily be separated from its brand, come to you in a tweet. You might even not know who the source or originator of that content is. So the ethical dimensions, the things that make that news reliable, have to be embedded and transparent in each piece of journalism so that you can see why you should believe that content, wherever it came from, because you may not know where it came from. Or it may come from an advocacy group, but could have all the inherent qualities of reliable work, despite the fact that it came from a group that you might be suspicious of. So one of the ethical dimensions is that the qualities need to be transparent and evident in each piece of journalism. So what does this mean for students, all of this? Well, first you need to learn the craft. Yes, you still need to learn some technique, but our journalism education has to be divorced from simply a craft model. You also need to learn the tools. You need to learn enough coding, technology, how to read data, things that journalists did not need to know. But fundamentally, I think you need to know how to think and distill like a journalist. What does this mean for teachers? Again, you need to teach craft. You need to teach code. You need to teach technology. I think we need to teach the history and ethics of journalism so that we can know where to go from here by knowing where we've been and how the values have evolved, which of the values are enduring and which are situational. We need to teach writing. No matter what your platform, even if you are fundamentally a data journalist or a visual journalist, if you cannot explain in words, in a sentence, what this chart is supposed to tell me, or what this visualization means, or what this database is revealing, then you don't understand the point of your story. You need to be able to distill. You need to be able to think. So journalism used to be a tautology. Journalism, it was whatever people branded as journalists did. Now it is something much more elevated. And to teach that, as I said before, we need to understand and teach journalism as an intellectual discipline that draws on skills from sociology, from statistics, from law, from ethnography. I'm not sure that curriculum fully exists yet, but we need to create it. And finally, I would say one other thing. Everyone who has ever practiced ethical communications, strategic communications, political communications, what we think of as journalism, is connected to all the people who came before. If you are an ethical storyteller, you are linked to the people who created those first newspapers in the coffee houses, or even the minstrels who traveled from city to city in medieval times and sang stories. But Western thought has probably created one idea that is more powerful and more enduring than any other, and that is that people can self-govern, that we can be free and lead ourselves. Journalism evolved out of that idea. It is the way in which we find out what is going on in an accurate way, in a way that is actionable, in a way that we can act on. It creates our common vocabulary, our common understanding, our sense, our foundation of facts by which we can operate and make compromise. The notion of democracy is also built on compromise, and journalists and the social flow they create are an essential part of that. That's a noble calling. That is an enduring calling. In the classes I've talked to today, I started by asking everybody how many people got up in the morning before they got out of bed and pulled out this device and looked at it before they even got out, before they were vertical. Everyone raised their hand in every class that I asked it. And I asked them where they went. And most of the people said that they went to sources on Twitter and elsewhere and got news. People are consuming more news than they ever have before. They are getting it from different places, but the idea that people are now consuming journalism before they get out of bed is not a bad thing for people who want to create the next journalism. So, are you crazy to be here? No. The potential exists, and I believe the future will fulfill the possibility, the probability, the certainty of a better journalism than we have ever had before. But it will not be taught to you by your professors. You will invent it. I hope with their help. Thank you.
Questions? Anyone? Don't be bashful. Journalism students should never be bashful.
And there's no such thing as a bad question, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. You know what?
Yeah.
In the book, The Elements of Journalism, I believe in the 6th chapter you talked about the original investigative journalism and reporting. Do you think that the new technology and computer-assisted reporting will replace and supersede that in the quality of uncovering and actually being out there in the field and documenting those events?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because I was thinking about that just the other day as I was preparing this, thinking about this talk. So in the book Elements, we say that there are different kinds of investigative reporting that people don't really think about, haven't really realized. And this really is, Bill, my co-author, Bill Kovach, really was the one who kind of unearthed this. There's investigative reporters who report on other people's investigations. The special prosecutor is doing this and this and this, and you're just kind of getting leaks about what he or she is doing. That's reporting on investigations. Another is this idea of the original investigation, where the reporter, him or herself, or their team, is actually doing the work. They're unearthing the sources. And then there's a kind of contextualized investigative reporting, where you get a leak, you get some information, but you have to figure out what it means. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of suddenly it's flown out of my head, the investigation that the New York Times did about Vietnam, where they were given a leak of the secret history of Vietnam that had been written by the National Security Agency. They got these secret documents, but it took weeks and weeks and weeks of reporting to figure out what those documents meant before they ever appeared in the newspaper. In many ways, the Snowden leaks of today are a version of that. So this comes, in my mind, very close to this idea of organizing the intelligence that others bring. You are not just doing your own, you're not in control of this entirely. And essentially anything that happens now that you uncover as a journalist is a little bit like creating an avalanche. You unearth some piece of rock and others begin to fall, because every exclusive is an exclusive for about 4 seconds now. So you are part of a collaborative intelligence the moment you publish. And your ability to do that in advance is really the only moment of exclusivity. It does mean, however, that that initial publication has to be really well organized. You have to do a lot before you launch into this, because it also means that if you allege something in an investigation and you don't have it right, you could easily be overwhelmed by people criticizing, and you could kind of submerge you could sink the work you're trying to advance by doing a bad initial job of it. But that notion of hierarchies of investigation is a very, I think, important window into thinking about, okay, so what do journalists do if we're no longer in control of the information? I mean, there's this quote that we use from Walter Lippmann that I've used many times, in which Lippmann says, I'm going to screw up the paraphrase, journalists sift through the gossip, the rumor, and the innuendo, and the facts that flow through a newsroom. This idea was, all this stuff would come into the newsroom, you'd figure out, and then you would say, okay, you're a fact, you get to go out. You're a rumor, you have to stay in here, we'll talk about you in the bar later. This is the classic definition of the press as gatekeeper, right? We get to decide what you, the public, know. That's gone. The press is no longer a gatekeeper except in this zone of a narrow band of information that you have unearthed but not yet published. So how do you play this game post-publication? And that's a fundamental part of this new organizing of community intelligence. Yeah.
After listening to you talk about the new enlightenment of journalism that we're about to come on to as future journalists, it sounds like a lot of responsibility. And I would just want to know what you would think is our biggest caution that we should have in taking all of this new knowledge and sifting through it and taking out and bringing out a objective story as a journalist should do.
So I don't know if everybody heard that.
Repeat it.
Yeah. So, okay, the question was, it sounds like a lot of responsibility to be the organizer of community intelligence and not just a person who writes a story and then, goes home. So what are the, what's the biggest caution that you would have for sort of the journalists of, these new journalists of this new enlightenment? I would say the biggest caution is one that that I think we started to advocate even before the internet, but not that long ago, which is humility. Recognize what you don't know. The old style of journalism that we used to teach, or that I was taught in graduate school, was never raise a question in a story that you cannot answer. Now that seemed like good advice. What it really meant was we fuzzed up our stories to write around all the things we didn't know. We made our stories seem like they were airtight when they weren't. We created, in other words, a false omniscience. Because in this kind of lecture environment of news, if you could sound authoritative, people would think you were authoritative. Now, in the era that we're in, you actually have to acknowledge what you don't know, and your authority comes from your honesty rather than a deep voice. That would be my answer. Yes?
Do you think the growth of the blogosphere is harmful for journalism? When you mentioned the displacement theory, you said that some people think journalism should just go away and we should let the bloggers do it, while others think that journalism should stay. So what do you think about that?
Well, first of all, blogging is not actually a particular set of values or a monolithic group of people. It's just a form. It's a looser form of writing in a more informal style or voice. The post could be shorter. It could be iterative in the sense that you post little things as you learn them. It could be a live blog, meaning you're writing almost chronologically, covering whatever it is, particularly a breaking news event. But the blog at the New York Times still maintains the fundamental values of the New York Times, maybe in a different style. While the blog that Michelle Malcolm writes, that's a sort of conservative, activist blogger, is sort of like Bill O'Reilly in a blog. So these things are not don't define one thing, first of all. But I would say that what blogging is it's sort of the first form in which anybody could publish, right? It's been replaced to a significant degree by social media. Or it was the first form of social media, but it's been replaced to a significant degree by simpler forms. What do I mean by that? Well, there were many blogs were created. Most blogs died after 10 days because to feed a blog, you have to really commit to it. You have to write well. You have to build an audience, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a one-to-many publishing system. Tweeting is much easier. It's 140 characters. You tweet when you want. You have a network of people. You can go in and out. People don't have to come to you. You tweet out into the stream. It's a many-to-many publishing system. And it's a lot easier to do 140 characters than to sustain a blog that people have to come to. Instagram and Pinterest are even easier. Fewer words at all. Maybe it's just pictures. So what's happening is, the simpler that these get, the greater the number of people who are into them. Facebook is by far the biggest. The majority of Americans are now on Facebook. Fewer than 20% of Americans are on Twitter. But Pinterest and Instagram will, I think, in a year, be larger than Twitter because they're easier to do. So my point is, these are not threats. These are new forms of community intelligence to be mined, to be vetted, to be taken advantage of in the most positive sense, to be used to gather intelligence. In my day, when I was a reporter, we weren't really covering the public debate about things. It was very hard to get to the kitchen table. We were covering the official debate about most things. It was very hard to know what people thought. Today, our potential for understanding that as journalists, as citizens, is so much greater. Now, one of the things we discover is we don't all get along as well as it sounded when everything was distilled and refracted through traditional news sources. We're less polite than we thought, or than it sounded like. But that's also part of this. I mean, somebody said to me, the question I get asked more than any other is, so with all the changes, are we better off or worse off? And the answer is always the same: yes. Yeah.
Going off what you just said, what do you think is more valuable, kitchen table journalism or official journalism?
So the question there is, I'm sorry, I didn't repeat your question. The question there is, so which is more important? Kitchen table journalism or kitchen table conversation, or official journalism, official conversation? I don't think it's either or, really. The Tea Party movement was a kitchen table conversation. That happened. And it's important. It's now, shall we say, affected the official conversation. Since the internet, political participation is up. More people vote. More young people vote. We're more polarized. Our government doesn't function as well, but more people are involved. It is more democratic. In fact, all of this is about making our information system and our political system more democratic. We just don't know how to cope with that yet. But it's not, I mean, there are moments when one is more important than the other, but these aren't either or. Now, it is true that journalists have more access to the official conversation. It also, as one of the quotes I offered, put it, we also know part of this official conversation more easily. But we don't want everything we know about the White House to be posted by the White House. And we don't want the president not to answer questions. The president is more effective, is a better president, not just this president, but any president, when they face hard questions. The fact that they have the ability to avoid them and create the impression that they're being transparent by posting things online and having a Tumblr account, that's hurting the president's effectiveness. It's not helping him. Just as journalists need to sort of engage in the network, the president needs to engage in jousting with old-fashioned journalism, because it's the only way he or she will be exposed to scrutiny directly. Yes?
What about monetizing? I mean, how far off are we from being able to monetize journalism again in a viable sort of way?
Okay, so this is obviously the toughest part of this. I mean, we're struggling with the tools, but frankly, newsrooms are I assume everybody heard the question because it came to that. Newsrooms, as much as they're struggling, are inventing. The New York Times has created snowfall techniques for new forms of storytelling. We're seeing innovations in the use of the network that we didn't see 5 years ago, a lot of them. The really profound disruption is on the financial side. A couple of statistics. Network news has lost half its audience. American newspapers have lost 55% of their ad revenue, about 45% of overall revenue. So they're half the size they were in 2009. That's profound disruption. Newspapers, which made 80% of their money from advertising, have half their audiences online now, but they only make about 10% of their revenue online. So we've gone from print dollars to digital dimes, and as we move to mobile, which is happening very rapidly, we're going to go to mobile pennies, it looks like. So how do we finance this? One way, well, the answer is there won't be one answer. There will be multiple revenue streams, many different revenue streams. And what we thought of as advertising, which is to say display ads with pictures, will be something very different. On a mobile, the answer to the next generation of digital is not more banner ads on your phone. It may be, however, I'm in a store, I'm looking at this product, I subscribe to this publication, I click and see what coupons I get as a subscriber that save me money. I subscribe to this newspaper, I'm looking at this product, the technology knows I'm looking at this product, I'm standing next to it, and it says, as a subscriber, you can get this for 10% off the price that's listed there. So there will be benefits to membership. That's what we used to think of as a coupon that you clipped in the newspaper. It will be something that is happening in real time, electronically, and is it is a function of being part of a community of readers, subscribers, members. That's one revenue stream. Another revenue stream is that we actually pay for the content. The American newspaper, on average, cost about $1.50 to produce, and was sold for about 35 to 50 cents. That meant that every newspaper was sold at a loss of $1 or more. It wasn't worth my printing that newspaper to send it to a poor person who the advertiser didn't want to reach, because the advertiser wouldn't pay me to reach that reader. So we created a system in which the economic incentives of American publishing were to ignore large parts of the population. That has ended. More and more of the monetization of our media will come from creating enough value that the consumer will actually want to pay for it. Now this creates a whole major paradigm shift. Much of the research, or what little was done in journalism, was to understand the psychographics and demographics of the audience so I could leverage my audience to the advertiser who paid the bills. Now we need to create a research that understands the needs of the audience so we can create a better journalism for them. Because the audience is now in charge. And this is a somewhat more European model, but it's also going to be a model that's going to come to the United States. This also means, by the way, we're going to need collaborations, because I might pay for one newspaper. I am not going to pay for 20 at the same price. And one place where American newspapers are not even having conversations is, okay, I subscribe to one and I can get 20 more, or I can get into a consortium at a much reduced price. Maybe $5 more, I get all newspapers, or everybody who's in this consortium, which is a more enlightened version of creating incentives for people to want to commit. We're very far away on the business side from those kind of enlightened understanding. That's essentially what Steve Jobs did with iTunes, right? We had Sony and Atlantic and all these other music companies saying, use our system, use our system, use our system, we're not going to play together. Steve Jobs came along and said, you know what, I'm no threat to you. Let's just try this as a collaboration, and then he owned the market. So we have a long way to go on the business side, a very long way. But this is a product that has value to people, which is why, by the way, BuzzFeed and Twitter and these other places are being valued heavily by the market. Why? They're building brand and market share, and Wall Street's happy about that because they think they will grow, but they don't know how to monetize themselves. Traditional journalism still has brand and market share and doesn't know how to monetize itself.
More question, Leland? Okay, yes.
As a journalist, how can we know the thing we told people we tell people is the truth? Because the definition of the truth is different for different group of people and different individuals. And how can we know we hold the right position in some big news or big events?
Okay, so the question there is, how do we know what's true, particularly when the truth means something different to different people? Fair translation there or summation? First of all, I believe journalism is about truth, not just getting the facts right, because you can't really separate these things. The Hutchins Commission in 1947, way back when they were looking at the emergence of television, said it's not enough to get the facts right, you have to get the truth about the facts right. In other words, you have to put the facts in a context that's true. But truth is not something that's necessarily found in every story. It is a process over time of sifting out, and we know then the truth of things. And that I am optimistic about. I think that happens all the time. It may take weeks, it may even take months, but we do, and our potential for doing that, if we pay attention, is greater than it used to be. Now, what does the meaning of that, of those true facts mean to you? That is where we move from what I would call practical or functional truth into sort of philosophical truth. And that is where we will part company. But we can know, what did he say? How many people died? Here I part company with my friend Clay Shirky, who says truth has never been anything more than consensus about things, and we don't have any consensus anymore. So, we've shed ourselves of the delusion of truth. There are many things about which we can know the truth. And these are not trivial things. Is the president alive or dead? How many did those miners come up or not from the mine disaster? Those are not trivial facts. Those are true things that matter. So, but as I said, it's not necessarily found in one story. The other part of this, which is important, I think, and challenging, it goes back to this point I was making before about when information is in greater supply, truth becomes, or knowledge becomes harder to create. When learning things is harder, there is a tendency to say, I don't want to learn anymore. Climate change, I know what I know what I need to know. I don't want to learn anymore because it's hard. It's like me in economics when I was at your age. look at all those charts and graphs, I know what I need to know, which is, just get a salary and pay your bills. So one of the things that in creating this new journalism in which we create community intelligence is we need to know better how people learn and how to present things in a way where they will accept them. And it may be that more data and fewer words is an important part of that. But people are beginning to study now what kind of presentation of news will allow somebody to actually learn something and maybe change their mind. Scholars are working on this at the University of Texas, at George Washington University, and elsewhere, probably here at MSU. This is a new area that's opening up because we're discovering that people won't change their minds when exposed to new information. So how do they do that? This is an example of where kind of the chaos leads to new questions, new scholarship, new knowledge.
Tom, thank you very much.
Thank you.